Engaging the community since 1970. This is WIS Awareness.
Good morning and thank you so much for joining us for Awareness. I'm your host, Megan Norman. In 2016, we recognized the 150th anniversary of the start of Reconstruction. It was a period in our nation's history where close to 4 million slaves made the transition to freedom, and the country began to rebuild after the Civil War. The history and memory of Reconstruction is still fresh in the fabric of the South, particularly here in South Carolina, where last year state leaders removed a symbol many see rooted in slavery. The Confederate flag divided communities, with some claiming heritage and others hate. In July of 2015, weeks after the racially charged massacre at Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, the Confederate flag was removed from State House grounds, where it had flown for 54 years, more than half a century. The Reconstruction era started more than 5 years after South Carolina became the first state to declare its independence from the Union. During this time and in the years that followed, we saw slavery abolished, citizenship granted to freed slaves, and the right to vote. While the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments ensured certain rights, this newfound freedom was met with resistance. It is described as a tumultuous transition. As we reflect on this period in history, this morning we start in a Columbia museum, what used to be the childhood home of our nation's 28th president, Tommy Woodrow Wilson, a home and childhood situated right in the middle of Reconstruction. First of all, thank you both so much for being with us. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
I want to start with, when did Reconstruction start?
Well, the beginnings of Reconstruction is a debatable topic. But South Carolina is sort of in the middle of the framework of understanding and defining Reconstruction. So many begin Reconstruction with the period of 1865, upon the end of the Civil War, the emergence of the transition from slavery to freedom. But ironically, South Carolina had experiments of Reconstruction well before that. There was this phase called the rehearsal for Reconstruction that took place along in the Low Country, in the Sea Isles around Beaufort, South Carolina, where there are areas in that part of the state where African Americans were in transition from slavery to freedom around 1861, 1862, as Union forces moved into the Deep South.
And let's talk more specifically about this tumultuous at times transition, especially here in South Carolina. What did it look like here in South Carolina during this Reconstruction period?
A total transformation of the politics of the state with the enfranchisement of freed people, African American men who participated in voting. Families participated in the political activism, mass meetings to embrace citizenship and fully participate in this open and first interracial experiment in democracy in our country, and electing a majority of African Americans to the lower house of the state house. So tremendous change, and then resistance to that change from many white South Carolinians who were not prepared for this opening up of the politics.
Do you think South Carolina, in terms of the southern states, showed the most resistance during Reconstruction just because they were the first to secede?
I think the word, when I think of the transition, is sort of cataclysmic. It was just that powerful and sudden. If you can imagine, for generations, people were enslaved. People were slaveholders. And with the turn of a page, forged by the Civil War, identities are now redefined. Power is redefined in the state. And so in South Carolina, you had African Americans who were, almost from the very beginning to define what they meant by citizenship, what they meant by freedom and equality. And at the very same time, you had individuals who were determined to sort of box in those ideas. From the very beginning, black codes emerged right after the Civil War, defined to constrict ideas of freedom. So there's this constant tension from the beginning of Reconstruction to the very end of Reconstruction, where African Americans and their allies are attempting to forge new ideas about what freedom is, and at the same time, those who are beholden to the Old South are trying to retain power or to reassert power.
Do you think the freedom was actually realized during the period of Reconstruction? And what do we classify as the period of Reconstruction?
That's another, time frame that's contested. But yes, freedom was enacted. I mean, people acted on their citizenship and their freedom and really transformed the state. We had, for the first time, public education provided for by the Reconstruction Era legislature. So freedom is, you embrace it, you enact it, and people realized it in their lives, of their families and their communities. As far as the ending of Reconstruction, often we look at 1877, the Compromise of 1877, when the final federal troops were removed, but people still had the vote and continued to actively participate in government and in the public life of the state. But then gradually you had the enactment of laws to limit the vote, and then segregation laws towards the turn of the century. So it's almost, from the late 1860s through the end of the 19th century is sort of the framework for this realization and action within the guarantees of the Reconstruction Amendments.
Now, even though we had laws passed that guaranteed or ensured freedom for these former slaves, many argue that freedom the fight for freedom continued up until and even through the Civil Rights Movement and even into today. So talk about that carryover, I guess, from Reconstruction to the Civil Rights.
Well, the work that we've been doing recently on defining and documenting Reconstruction connects directly to the work we've done on civil rights with the Columbia Essay 63 project, because when you look at some of the language and some of the arguments in the late 50s and mid 60s, it is about a second emancipation or a second Reconstruction, where there's a struggle to fully realize the dreams, the hopes, and the aspirations of those from the 19th century. And you're right that even though there were laws, statutes on the books in the 1860s and 1870s, they were not always enacted or enforced. They were not always respected. And so African Americans themselves are saying, these are the things that are on books, these are on statutes, and how does that impact our right for land, our right for labor, our right for literacy, places of worship? And so that is the constant struggle from 1865 through the contemporary moment.
Do you feel like the Reconstruction era is kind of a forgotten part of history, that people vividly remember the Civil War, people vividly remember the Civil Rights Movement, but maybe not so much the Reconstruction era, a very important part of our history?
I think it's a critical part of our history and a critical chapter in our history. And one of the things we know just from studying how Reconstruction has been taught and researched is that there have been very deliberate efforts to misconstrue, to misrepresent the period of Reconstruction. And almost from the very beginning, African American scholars and writers have attempted to fight against those narrow definitions of Reconstruction that described it as a tragic era or an unfortunate failure. And so from the early years of W.E.B. Du Bois, Carter G. Woodson, and other pioneering scholars, there was a direct effort to provide a different interpretation of Reconstruction. And it is no irony that we gather here in the Woodrow Wilson House. I mean, Woodrow Wilson was a historian, spent years at Princeton University, and he himself had a very narrow understanding of Reconstruction that described it as a tragic failure. I mean, he saw truth and veracity in Birth of a Nation, a 1915 film that provided a very dark portrait of Reconstruction that was not terribly flattering to African Americans, who were the major architects of Reconstruction. And so just the idea of what is the history of Reconstruction has been as fiercely contested as anything else in American history.
When we talk about when Reconstruction started, I know the time period kind of it gets contested, but did people really know what to do? Did they know what freedom looked like?
One of our participants in this wonderful symposium we had last week was Louis Burke, and he reminded us that during the Reconstruction period, 25% of the lawyers in South Carolina were African American. So imagine that, a period with slavery, no citizenship rights, and the embrace of African Americans and their active role working with citizens throughout the state through mass meetings, through columns in newspapers, to remind them of really support the rights, support efforts to sustain and enact their rights. So it's, as Dr. Donaldson said, it's such a deep and rich period, so much is happening, but that's that embrace of the guarantees and the fighting to enact these guarantees through law.
And I said the answer is yes, they knew exactly what freedom meant. This has been molding them in their minds for generations. And so freedom means the right to own oneself, the right to live where you choose, the right to be educated where you wish to be educated, the right to worship in your own space. And in this state, all of those questions are being debated, contested, and challenged through that entire period. So Allen University, Benedict College, many of our African American congregations all find their roots in that very moment when people say, yes, we know what freedom is, and it means having a place of our own where we can worship, where we can be educated without having the sort of the weight of white power on our shoulders.
And yet they were constantly met with resistance for decades.
And fought back too, by the way.
Right, very good point to bring up. Well, we're just getting started with a really great conversation. Stay with us, we'll have more after the break.
I think it's C, 10%.
I'm gonna say 20%.
20%. C?
10%? Yes.
I believe it, yeah.
South Carolina had a lot of slaves. 400,000 slaves.
When you're in a car wreck, it can turn your life upside down, but you don't have to deal with it on your own. We'll help you set things right. Call George Sink Injury Lawyers at 803-ALL-9s.
They really did turn my life back around.
It's the event of the year, the 19th Annual Columbia Black Expo at the Columbia Metropolitan Convention Center. Join us May 21st and enjoy the Beauty and Wellness Spa, health fairs, seminars, Greek Village, celebrity guests, and performances. And returning this year, Black Expo Bugs. Want to showcase your product or service in front of the largest consumer market in the U.S.? Exhibitor spaces are available. It's the 19th Annual Columbia Black Expo. Click blackexposouth.com.
Next time, be the first to know when the weather changes. Stay ahead of Mother Nature with the WIS First Alert Weather app. Download today and stay dry out there.
When severe weather strikes, the WIS First Alert Weather Team is here for you.
There's the storm. We're going to stay with this because that storm is approaching downtown.
A team of meteorologists monitoring the weather around the clock, keeping you ahead of the storm.
This is moving to the east at about 40 miles per hour.
Letting you know first, on air, online, and on your mobile device. WIS First Alert Weather.
Hurt in a car wreck or hurt at work? Don't know who to call? George Sink Injury Lawyers was voted best law firm 2 years in a row by readers of the state newspaper.
If you want to get all the money you deserve, call George Sink Injury Lawyers at 803-ALL-9s.
When we look at the end of Reconstruction, what phase would you say followed that period?
As sudden as Reconstruction emerges, and that's an exaggeration, but in the minds of many, the shift from slavery to freedom was sudden, as was this coming down of the curtain. So in April of 1877, federal troops who were in place in Columbia and around South Carolina to maintain peace, they depart. They leave the front of the State House midday in April of 1877, and in their departure, there goes hopes and dreams of people who realize that once those troops are no longer present, people revert back. And that's exactly what happens. I mean, when we see red shirts and white militia sort of zigzagging across the state, in one particular purpose, it is to put black people back in their place. And again, that is fiercely contested. But even as that is happening, even as you have this pale of white terror and white supremacy, black folk are not sort of burying their heads in the sand. They're still pushing. And although official Reconstruction comes to an end in 1877, there was actually an African American in Congress through the 1890s in South Carolina. His name was George Washington Murray, who was from Sumter, who defied attacks, defied intimidation, and maintained power well after the official end of Reconstruction. And the same was true in Beaufort and in Georgetown as well, where you still had black elected officials throughout the 1870s, 1880s, and the 1890s.
And that's really important. I mean, to note, both the dramatic pullback on the part of the federal government, but the persistent struggle. Another dimension of that in terms of, in addition to political participation, is that as the southern states gradually began to implement segregation laws, when they realized they really, after Plessy v. Ferguson, they had an open season there. In this state, when they segregated the streetcars, black people boycotted the streetcars in Columbia. In the early 20th century, there were at least 25 boycotts throughout the South. So people standing up to that. And in the end, the boycotts were not successful, but they sort of planted the seeds. And as Charles Houston would often say, they kept the light burning. You know, the people understood what their rights and their citizenship were.
So if you were to stand in front of the State House now, it is a reminder of how much more work there is for us to do in terms of documentation and interpretation of Reconstruction. So right in front of our State House is the Confederate Monument that is placed there during the post-Reconstruction period. To the left, of course, is the new African American monument on the east side of the State House. But to the right of the Confederate marker is the statue of Ben Tillman. And there is nothing on that statue that says in 1895, Ben Tillman helped to orchestrate a new constitution that tried to and did uproot the progress of the 1868 Constitution. And there's very little that says that under his watch, violence is endorsed and ordained by officials of South Carolina, designed to undermine the political and social rights of African Americans in this state.
Do you think that monument needs to be on the State House grounds?
I'm one of the few who actually believes the monument should stay right where it is, but it should be reinterpreted. It should have appropriate language that defines exactly who he is. And I also believe that there should be other markers on the State House grounds. I mean, one of the things I believe that, so Ben Tillman was from Edgefield County. Majeska Monteith Simpkins has roots in Edgefield County as well. And I think it would be a sort of poetic justice to juxtapose a monument to Majeska Monteith Simpkins, a pioneering civil rights figure, right next to Ben Tillman, so that students and visitors can see that we actually have a complicated history. Now, it's not an easy history to digest, and I'm sure those who support tourism may not find that an attractive alternative. But for those of us who believe in an accurate historical interpretation of the state, I think keeping Ben Tillman right where he is, juxtaposed with other figures with appropriate language, I think is most instructive.
To illustrate the full complicated history.
Right.
Well, also on the State House grounds, the Confederate battle flag was there up until recently, last summer. Very divisive symbol. There are many symbols of the past. How do we interpret some of those symbols in present day?
Well, it's important to be mindful that the Confederate flag, it went up during the centennial of the Civil War, and it was supposed to remain up for 1 year. But we were in the midst of the Civil Rights Movement. And so it was stayed as a symbol of defiance of what, again, it was being called the Second Reconstruction, and it remained there for decades. I think the fact that it's come down is very important. But these symbols, as Dr. Donaldson pointed out, Ben Tillman, I mean, what do we remember? How do we remember it? But the Confederate flag, so contested, and it took such an awful tragedy to finally have it taken down.
And let's talk about the importance of this history, especially in our recent history in the last year with the Confederate battle flag being taken down from the State House grounds, Mother Emanuel. How important is it for us to really understand this history and see that it isn't just a period of history that we just forget about and just leave in the past, because clearly it's carried over through the years?
Well, ironic about Mother Emanuel was a resurgent church that was caused to go underground during the antebellum period that comes back into being in the 1860s. And one of the pioneers of Mother Emanuel was a guy named Richard Daddy Kane, a very influential Republican Reconstruction figure who was very active in redefining what citizenship is. He was one of the major players in the 1868 Constitutional Convention that orchestrated a new understanding of what freedom and citizenship meant in South Carolina. And one of the prevailing planks of that Constitution was free public education, which we still enjoy and benefit from today.
This state is so full of all of it. You know, the possibility, the promise, the really enactment of what this country says it is, and how people did that and endured over generations. as well as the resistance to that. And it is sort of ironic that we're here in the Woodrow Wilson house. Woodrow Wilson grew up during Reconstruction, and now this house is showcasing really the wrong interpretations that came out of the history he wrote and that was enshrined in the birth of a nation. So I think Columbia and South Carolina is a place that is actively working to get this history right and show that it's a living history, that it challenges all of us today to understand it, to teach it, and to carry that struggle forward.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both for providing this great historical context and this snapshot in history. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
When Awareness returns, we take you back inside the Woodrow Wilson house.
It was supposed to kind of be a time period where people gain their rights for the first time, but that it really wasn't. There was still a lot of problems.
Most of our family that live in the North, their ancestors originally lived down south and they migrated up there. And I was like, oh, it makes sense why, most of my family lives in like parts of New York and Maryland. I was like, now it adds up.
We're in the Woodrow Wilson home. Tell us a little bit about its origins.
Sure. The Woodrow Wilson family home is a special South Carolina site for many reasons, but particularly for Woodrow Wilson, who, when he was 13, almost ready to turn 14, and then known as Tommy, he would have been moving into a brand new house, and a house, really the only house that his parents would have owned. It was during the Reconstruction period that his family moved to Columbia, and so with that in mind, during our recent rehabilitation, this site was restored to the period in which his family would have lived here.
Give us some context of what it was like here during that time period.
The time period in which the Wilsons would have called Columbia home was in the middle period of the Reconstruction era. So this is post-Civil War. It's a time in which Columbia and Richland County, South Carolina, the South, indeed the entire nation, was trying to understand this post-Civil War period in which many individuals who previously had been enslaved Africans and African Americans, particularly men who now had the right to vote, what it meant to be citizens. Right. Teasing out not just the legal components of it, but the social nuances, the economic impact. So it's a tumultuous period. But if you can imagine being here in Columbia, in South Carolina, really where the Civil War started for all intents and purposes, because this house, interestingly enough, is located only about 3.5 blocks east of where the Ordinance Secession was drafted and the convention was held at the Baptist Church. So you have these kind of interesting bookends. Here at the Woodrow Wilson family home, today it's a museum that explores Reconstruction. It looks at Tommy Wilson and his family in the city of Columbia, but it also looks at all of the contexts in which the family would have lived.
We'll be right back with the final thought. South Carolina has a very rich and complicated history. It's not just black or white, slave or free, it's American history. And it's important to tell all of it and understand how that history lives on today. We want to hear from you. Continue the conversation with us on social media. And if you ever miss a show or want to see it again, visit our WIS Awareness Facebook page. Just search Awareness 10. Until next time, I'm Megan Norman. This is Awareness.